What we got here is failure to communicate, a chronic neglect of military mental health care. This is Psychiatric Casualties, how and why the military ignores the full cost of war.
Welcome to Psychiatric Casualties. This is Mark Russell.
I'm Charles Figley.
And in this week, we're going to be covering Chapter 7 of our book, Psychiatric Casualties, which is Purging Weakness, the fifth dark strategy that the military uses to avoid learning its war trauma lessons. And this, as I was sharing with you earlier, Charles, for me, this particular chapter was the one I probably enjoyed the most to write on, to research and to write about it. And so I'm glad we're getting a chance to delve into this for these two episodes.
Yeah, it came through in terms of your interest and investment and concern, importance of this particular chapter. It came through in the writing, really, as well as, our enthusiasm.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I can tell you a little bit why it's particularly important to me, and that is, as a clinical psychologist and having gone to graduate school and then now taught in graduate school as you have, the issue that has come up repeatedly in the history of mental health is the question about trauma and whether trauma, environmental events, exposures to traumatic events can lead to genuine suffering, traumatic stress injuries, as we call them, and have been called different names over the past, railway spine, right? We talked about, of course, shell shock, people are familiar with that, combat fatigue, PTSD, and the like. And so it really boils down to a question of etiology, and that what is the legitimate causes of that type of mental health suffering? And we talked about in earlier episodes on this podcast that what historically has been called the trauma pension debates. And this is just as a quick rewind, that is since the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution, started in Europe and then, of course, North America, there were a lot more industrial accidents. And then at that time, and this was like in the 1860s, that it was believed that traumatic stress injuries caused by a railway accident or other industrial accidents were legitimate suffering and had to do with some type of an injury to the brain, even if it wasn't apparent, like somebody didn't have a hole in their head or anything, but that violent commotion, as they called it, caused some disruption in the brain's function, and therefore were medically, legally compensable. And so there people could get a disability pension just as if they had lost a leg or lost an eye as a result of the accident. But this trauma pension debate started stirring up a controversy where companies, businesses started hiring lawyers to attack the legitimacy of that suffering. And they argued that it wasn't the traumatic event that caused their suffering, it was their predispositions, it was their weakness, their hysteria. And therefore, these should not be compensable. And so this trauma pension debate has ebbed and flowed throughout history, is still with us very much today. And nowhere is that even more apparent than in the history of warfare and psychiatric casualties, and how the military and its government have struggled in their own way with the whole trauma pension debates and about whether people should be compensated for their wartime trauma exposures. So here we are talking about purging of weaknesses, and this is again one reason why I'm really interested in this chapter, is that for me, the whole issue, the trauma pension debate, what causes, in this case, PTSD, and is it a legitimate suffering, has been settled. And it's just not widely known. It was settled after the Second World War. And then for whatever reason, or you can imagine what reasons, we'll talk about it, but it hasn't been settled in the minds of the military or the government, because we still continue to hash out and treat mental health differently than we do a physical wound from war. So, but anyway, this whole matter, as we'll go through, has been settled in the largest social experiment ever conducted, and that was again during the Second World War.
Yeah, it's interesting though that, and I think you mentioned this, that we continue to replay this, right? Every generation, every war, it seems like we have to make up for lost ground. And I learned that even at my age, going through life, and I said, "What? Why are you asking that?"
Yeah.
And where it came out really were journalists. They were not up to date at all with what's going on, and so it's been frustrating. And then for me to be in the middle of that, in terms of being the Vietnam War, it didn't really sink in for me. I mean, I was sort of focusing on my own little responsibilities, etc., within the Marine Corps, like you were, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
But it was, yeah, it's kind of a frustrating and strange thing. But one of the things I'm going to talk about whenever we want is to talk about. Now, let me just pull that book out, unless I buried it someplace. But willful blindness, I think I've mentioned this a couple of times. Why we ignore the obvious at our own peril, really, is the subtitle of Heffernan's book. Mm-hmm. It's highly relevant to explaining how we can turn a blind eye to problems. And let me just mention 3 problems.
Okay.
And I won't go into them now, but a little bit later. Well, Abu Ghraib is an example of that. The My Lai massacre is another example of that. You see or you don't see, what is so obvious, and yet, I look away and all that. It's remarkable how that it continues throughout history. And she even makes the argument that this is going to be continuous, that people are able to kind of fudge it because of their subjective perceptions. And so my bet is that I'll be pulling, if I can find the book, pulling it off the shelf on a regular basis for the rest of my life, probably. But really great examples that are provided there.
Yeah, no, really are. And I also I want to kind of frame a little bit too about, I talked about the military struggle with trauma pension debates and this whole issue of why they chose to ignore the war trauma lessons of, that large numbers of legitimate spectrum of war stress injuries are caused by modern warfare. But here's the framing of it. So in 1966, Colonel Apple of the U.S. Army, the psychiatrist, he had been commissioned to investigate some classified studies by the Army during the Second World War about the effects of war and mental health. And so this was one of his concluding statements, quote, "In the beginning of World War II, military authorities, both lay and medical, believed that psychiatric disorders occurred only in predisposed individuals / weaklings. This led to the endorsement of and the reliance upon the policy of psychiatric screening." And this is where we'll be talking about the purging of weakness. As the war progressed, these authorities discovered that most mental disorders occurred in, quote, normal, unquote, men, and that screening was ineffective in preventing that occurrence of such conditions. Again, that was the Army's official lessons learned after the Second World War. But then, so you think, okay, so we learned our lesson, right? And as you were saying, each generation, cohort kind of forgets and then has to relearn and rediscover these. So this is in the current U.S. Army's textbook on war psychiatry. And this is how they've summarized their views. And they say chronic PTSD occurs, quote, in those with social and biological predispositions, in whom the stressor is meaningful when the social supports are inadequate. Other mechanisms, such as positive reinforcement, secondary gain in Freud's model, or malingering in a more of a medical legal sense, seem more important in the chronic maintenance of symptoms. Whatever the theory of causation, PTSD symptoms appear to be relatively universal given a severe enough stressor, which we can all agree, then they deviate. However, it is not the presence of symptoms, but the psychological purposes that they serve that determines the degree of disability. And just to juxtapose that statement, which is the modern U.S. Army view, and again, this is their textbook on war psychiatry, you have from the First World War, the German neurologist Oppenheim, who coined the term traumatic neurosis. And he writes this about his lessons learned from the First World War, even during the very beginnings of the First World War. Quote, "The war has taught us and will continue to teach us, one, that just as before there are traumatic neuroses, which is the equivalent to what we call PTSD today. Two, that they are not always covered by the concept of hysteria meaning predisposition, weakness, and kind of a pseudo illness, not a real genuine suffering. And three, that they are really the product of trauma and are not goal-oriented, well-cultivated pseudo illnesses," unquote. So you have the lessons learned that Oppenheim summarizes, and even the American Army recognized at the end of the Second World War. But then here we go into the current day textbook on war psychiatry, and the Army is still emphasizing predispositions and the purpose of symptoms as a reason for why people might have some disability. Purpose meaning that they can escape their duty, right? They could be given a pension, for example. Right. All the things that we talked about before as the trauma pension debate that rears its ugly head. So I just wanted to kind of frame that. These are from the mouths of other people who have looked at this during their cohorts, adventures into war, and their conclusions and kind of where we are today.
But it's still not settled.
Absolutely not settled.
Despite that, it's remarkable.
Yeah, you can look at the vast literature that was, published during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and there's been a lot of researchers, and you can still see this debate played out, where you have researchers, and maybe they're motivated by their own bias, or they're representing the bias of the military, but they'll basically say they re-emphasize the issue about predispositions, and actually advocating for more stringent psychiatric screenings to prevent this epidemic of PTSD claims that they say, unprecedented from this current generation that, did not exist before, which is also not true, but still, yeah, it's alive and well, unfortunately. And this is why this chapter means so much.
Yes.
Me personally, and like you, having struggled with that, during our time in service, but after we got out and talking to veterans and family members and friends, etc., that served in the military, and this issue should put this matter to rest. This chapter should put this matter to rest, and we'll see if it has that effect or not. But
I was wondering when you would break out in laughter or smile, at least.
Oh,
But I'll tell you, I'm very, very proud of what we did. I mean, this is the most comprehensive that I'm aware of, at least this day and age. And man, and I think that's one of the reasons why we haven't heard from the military, even those that, don't necessarily represent the military. They certainly have talked about it and spoken out. But yeah, official word from the military, no, nothing like that as far as I know. Are you aware of any?
Oh, no.
Response to the book?
I'm not aware of any response to the book, but I have read, I don't know, 100 or so books and written about the topic of combat stress, and from different generations, from different ethnicities, etc., different perspectives. And I've never come across a single writing that talks about the meaning and the scope of the military's psychiatric screening experiment and trying to reduce or eliminate pensions and by eliminating weakness. And well, so I do take certain pride that you and I have at least put words on paper, that it's now publicly available to anyone who wants to read it or to listen to this podcast, that we strongly refute this whole notion that people who succumb to traumatic stress injuries are somehow were predisposed and weak to begin with, and that, or they were motivated by secondary gain, to get a pension or to get out of duty, etc. Yeah,
I think that the table 7.1, when comparing World War I and World War II with regard to total rejected, the mobilization, etc., then total disability discharge, huge difference. Even though, it's not even art. It can't be debated. It seems like it's so obvious, not just by the numbers,
right?
the methodology of coming up with this. It's phenomenal.
Yeah, for me, it's phenomenal. Then again, that it hasn't even been, the topic hasn't even been broached yet. That none of these other researchers or authors have looked at the same data that we looked at when it comes to that table that you're talking about, the psychiatric screenings from the First and the Second World War, and with the conclusion that should end the whole trauma pension debate, which again, we're going to delve into that in some earnest with these 2 episodes.
Yeah. So let's dig into that. I'm going to skip over what we did last time.
Yeah.
And that will encourage people to watch the show and not have to get notes. But, I think that the colleagues that we're working with do summarize for us. Have you noticed that? You've been following this particular issue, and what the cliff notes, or what are the description in the beginning? Have you noticed that?
I have not.
Yeah, it's pretty good, and most of them at least. And I was surprised because that it takes a certain amount of effort to be able to come up with that summary. So,
well, I'm very appreciative of those whoever took the time to try to summarize and make notes of our.
Well, it seems like they feel the same way we do. They want to make sure people get it, that understand this, and that thoroughly understand it.
Absolutely, and very much appreciated.
Very much so.
Together.
Yeah, so we covered at least 5 stories or incidences or issues that I think we fairly clearly presented, I think.
Yeah.
But in terms of that particular one, I wanted to mention that whole experience, and then how it sort of sets us up for this particular issue. There was a Marine Corps colonel that I got to know very well. I can't really remember. I can't say his name. And he said to me, "My commander orders me to prevent suicide among those in my command. I diligently give the same order to those who report to me. Now what?" So in other words, he does what they say, but that's not going to stop them from killing themselves by saying, "This is an order. You're not allowed to kill yourself." What the fuck does that mean? It's ridiculous. So he feels, fairly frustrated, and he's, I think, out of the Marine Corps by now. But it was kind of sad.
Well, something on the same topic is that it's against the UCMJ to attempt to commit suicide, and some of the controversy that happened after the Iraq invasion was in the military's response. And this wasn't widespread, but it was reported in the media. And their efforts to try to prevent suicide and the near epidemic levels of suicide after during the 2 wars, and so they started prosecuting people who attempted suicide but survived, and they started prosecuting them for the UCMJ in order to send a message out to the ranks that this is illegal. You've been given a lawful order not to commit suicide. It violates the UCMJ, therefore don't do it. And I think the other part of that was that the people who had committed suicide was that the military was punishing their families. Not only did they lose their family member and often their primary income earner, but they wouldn't get compensation. They wouldn't get the SGLI, the life insurance, because they had committed, a wrongful act, violating a illegal act by killing themselves, according to UCMJ. So you just added hurt to hurt. Now, fortunately, I think the military has kind of rectified that since then, and is not prone to legally try to hold people responsible for act of desperation that suicide is. But
Yes, definitely.
yeah. So I have real sympathy for your friend the colonel, who had to be pressured by top down to eliminate suicides, as if any one person really has that power to do that.
And it tore him up, and I know it tore other officers up that had to, follow the order, but also the frustration of not being able to stop suicides. I mean, it's incredibly frustrating.
But the whole research on military suicide, there's been a lot done, right, with all the fanfare and the publicity of 22 veterans a day committing suicide, and I think it was something like 17 or 19 in the military a day or something like that, is that the researchers on it kind of, again, pointed to the problem is predispositions. That those who were committing suicide were predisposed, were weak to begin with, and their entry into the military, or their experiences in the military, had really nothing to do. Like, war does not cause people to want to kill themselves. And so that was the repeated refrain. And most of these researchers, I might add, a lot of them that had that view, were commissioned by the military or the VA or the government in order to study military suicides. And that was their overwhelming conclusion. Again, that it was weakness that led to them. They were predisposed to it. And it had nothing to do with their exposures to military or war-related stressors.
Even though throughout history, it's noted over and over again. I mean, it's small group, doesn't get out much apparently, but you can't miss it if you
can't miss it. Well, we researched it, and we write about in the book about suicides in particular, that every war, every conflict has led to a string, an epidemic, if you would, of suicide. You can go back to the Spanish-American War. We even talked about in the American Revolutionary War that the father of American psychiatry, Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was General Washington's Surgeon General during that time, wrote in his memoirs the first textbook on psychiatry for Americans. And he talks about these two identical twins who were both served as captains in the American Army, and who had no apparent predispositions. And both were pillars in their community. They were married. They were churchgoers. They were the kind of people in their communities that people sought out. So they had strong leadership. They had a lot of cohesion, a lot of social support. They go fight the war, in the Revolutionary War, and they both come back. And within, I think, a year after coming back, they both commit suicide under the diagnosis of melancholia, which is today depression. Mm-hmm. And so Rush makes this conclusion that, oh, wow, that this has to do with their, what they were exposed to during the times of the war, because there was nothing in their earlier history that suggested they were predisposed or weak, and therefore that's what caused and the fact they were identical twins was even more interesting, doesn't it? And they were living in different parts of the state, so they weren't like living together and had that, but they each independently had developed melancholia, that each ended up taking their own lives too.
It's a great case study.
It is, yeah.
Well,
But the whole issue again is that weakness is the enemy the military and its government has identified. We got to get rid of weakness. And that's how we get into this chapter about how do we purge that weakness? How do we screen out anybody who could be predisposed so that they don't go on and develop PTSD and need to be pensioned or cause attrition in the ranks, and or that they don't commit suicide or any other of these kind of public nuisance conditions that the military wants to eradicate.
Well, one of the things that we start out with in terms of, or at least in the chapter, we start out by looking at screening and how effective it is. And we discover it ain't, well, we knew that it isn't effective at all. And it's remarkably ineffective for all of the efforts and all that. So that's among the lessons learned, but then forgotten, or one way or the other has not been kept in place.
What was that term you used? You were talking about the research was willful blindness.
Oh, blindness.
Yes. Yeah, definitely lessons forgotten. But it's, you go back to screening, psychiatric screenings in the military, we could trace that back to the American Civil War.
Oh.
And at that time, the Surgeon General for the Union Army, William Hammond, in 1862, saw that there was a very high level psychiatric attrition occurring in younger people. So, before 1862, the Union Army would let people under the age of 15, even 15, 16, 17, 18, serve in the military. And they found that in those younger ages, there were higher levels of psychiatric breakdown. And so he proposed and set in a policy to screen out based on age that anyone, you had to be 22 or older in order to enlist. Now that policy may have wavered at certain ebbs as the war ebbed and flowed, right? And for the next 3 years going, but that was a policy, and they started doing some screenings, and in order to eliminate the weakness that was at that point was attributed to age alone, not the war itself or the traumatic stressors these people were facing, but that their age somehow predisposed them to weakness, right?
Yeah. Nope.
Yeah. So, but then the First World War is where it took on a whole another level. I mean, it's when we really started investing into psychiatric screening and purging weakness. And this really began in the United States. As you know, the American military did not enter into the First World War until the very final year. And 1918 is when the First World War ended. So we had sent people over, and this was Colonel Salmon, we talk about. And he was appointed as the head of American Army's neuropsychiatry and went to Europe to go look at France and Britain and all the other allies and how they were dealing with then the epidemics, what they were calling shell shock and traumatic neuroses, etc. And what were the reasons and how the American military can learn from the European allies to not replicate the problems that they're having, these epidemics, and that they were facing mass attrition that were, and an explosion of disability pensions from that. So what they concluded was we need to screen out weakness, because that was what the British and the French and others were saying was the principal cause. These people are coming into service. They were weak to begin with. They had predispositions. So now let's screen them out. So the United States developed the first intelligence tests to use to be screening. This was the Army Alpha and the Army's Beta test. The Beta was a nonverbal cognitive screening, and the Alpha was a more verbal kind of intelligent screening. And they were trying to eliminate, they called imbeciles, people with low intellectual abilities who they believe were ripely predisposed to illness. On top of that, the very first personality inventory was developed, a personality test called the Woodworth Personality Inventory. And that was used as well as the Alpha and the Beta cognitive tests to screen out recruits and the volunteers from the Army. the U.S. Army. And they ended up screening out, I think, rejecting over 70,000 volunteers who came into the military. And then another 15,000 were rejected, those who got through basic training and went on to be staged at Europe, but started showing some signs of weakness. So they discharged an additional 15,000. And what they found was that after only 6 months of war, because the Americans again entered into the very end of the First World War, and it was only deployed for actually 6 months of combat, that over 100,000 of those soldiers end up succumbing to psychiatric breakdown. And 70,000 had some type of, were discharged with a psychiatric disability within those ranks, right? And about $1 billion worth of pensions back in that time due to disability. And that was only 6 months into the American War. The British, the French, the Germans, the Italians, I mean, every European power that was involved in the First World War had similar high rates, unprecedented rates of psychiatric breakdown, and similar financial strain caused by disability pensions for those folks. So they hired some commissions, they did some investigations, and they had the top psychiatrists, the top neurologists in the world, and convene into these conferences and investigate. And they concluded, well, what was the main cause of the war? Was it of the psychiatric casualties in the First World War? Was it because of the nature of the warfare, trench warfare, the advent of airplanes, the high explosive artillery, tanks, and chemical warfare, right, that we all know about? Or was it predisposed weakness? That really is the underlying reason why we had this unprecedented levels of psychiatric breakdown. So which do you think they might have concluded? The effects of war or predisposed weakness?
Frustrating.
Yeah. So obviously they chose weakness. They said that it had to do with poor unit morale, poor leadership training, inadequate military training, military bearing, and a host of personality factors, that these people should never have been in the military. They lacked that stiff upper lip. They were not real men. They were very effeminate. They had some type of disability coming into the military, et cetera, et cetera. So even though the screenings in the First World War showed that it was not totally effective, at least it indicated that it might not be effective in eliminating weakness, the military drew its lessons from the First World War that no, in fact, we need to double down on psychiatric screening, that we just didn't do a good enough job. It wasn't the war itself. It wasn't exposure to traumatic stressors or the neurotoxic effects of modern combat, modern battlefields. It was personal weakness and social weakness. Psychiatry is also taking the hit too, if you might recall that they labeled the psychiatrists in the Army in the First World War and the fledgling psychologists as corrosive moral influences, that because of our labeling, our presence, we coddled people, that we encouraged people to seek refuge in a diagnosis like shell shock or traumatic neurosis, and then in effect awarded them for it. So, and the Germans had a name for another responsible factor was the fact that you're giving people disability pensions for psychiatric casualties, and they called it, the English translation is pension neuroses. So it was a pension sickness. So every reason except the effects of war were given to explain the.
Let me ask you, have you, in your forensic work, have you run into the other side making an argument that, this isn't really news?
Always. Always.
I don't understand how they can do that with a straight face. I mean, I understand they're getting paid, and that has some influence on the way their diagnosis and all that, but it's just remarkable.
But the thing is, within our profession, the professions of mental health, right, or behavioral health, you have very strong advocates who are psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers, strong advocates for predisposed weakness. People who written books that PTSD is an illusion. It's a diagnosis that was perpetrated by anti-war Vietnam activists and is not a bona fide diagnosis. And so you can find literature to support that view. You can find research studies that support that view. And that's what you'll find in the legal system. And you'll find they'll hire experts who will refute that PTSD is legitimate, or that this person suffered from their accident and it was more due to their personality makeup. It was due to their predispositions, not the event itself. So that's a very common part of our legal judicial system.
Well, don't those same guys, well, men or women, do they get a little nervous when they talk to you, or they're presenting and you're in the audience or something like that? Has that happened?
I'm sorry, do they get nervous?
The other side that's making an argument. Have you interacted with them in any way? And
well, they have something called depositions.
oh yes,
I've gone through many of these. I haven't only been to trial once.
But in terms of depositions, were you there to help the lawyer pose the appropriate questions?
Well, when I'm being deposed, I'm being grilled the questions, but I have helped lawyers prepare for depositions, of the other side, their experts and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, so it's an adversarial approach. So you can find, attorneys that are representing one side. It's like seeing the trauma pension debate being relitigated. You have those who are in favor of trauma, that it's about the trauma and that's what causes the injuries and it's legitimate suffering and compensable. And then you have the others who, that trauma pension debate that says, no, it's predispositions, it's weakness, it's anything other than the traumatic event. And that's exactly what we see in the military, historically, over and over again, repeated, and we see it in society. And again, well, our position is that if the military took the lead and fully ending the trauma pension debates, that we would probably start to see mental health more broadly accepted in society, and less emphasis on predisposed weakness and more on the events themselves, that and understanding that.
Well, I was going to mention, the beginning of the chapter talked about this. It started with the fact that screening is ineffective at preventing combat-related stress, and that's what we're talking about now.
Yeah.
And the lessons that are not being learned. Unfortunately, there's a lot of them that, unfortunately, people, well, again, the blindness, they don't choose not to look and choose not to see. There's a natural psychiatric attrition when the rubber hits the road, apparently, right? So the rubber, the planning for combat hits the road, the war realities and the hard combat conditions, that's what you get.
That's what you get.
Yeah.
So in this one documentary film that I participated in was Thank You for Your Service. It was 2015 by Tom Donahue. It's not the Steven Spielberg Thank You for Your Service. That's not to be confused with that. But this was the first documentary that really kind of talked about my struggles with trying to get the military to learn its war trauma lessons and to prevent a mental health crisis during these recent wars. And in that, they talked to the top Army psychiatrist in this documentary. And I think she was a 2 or 3-star general. And sat in on the war planning to the invasion of Iraq. And, here we are invading a sovereign country that we think is well armed and has biological, chemical weapons and nuclear weapons, potentially would use them.
We thought, yes.
Yes, we thought, and that was the so-called intelligence reports on that. But at any rate, the war planners were talking about what do we need to prepare for that, the invasion. And it came time to psychiatry, and according to this major general, she was shut down immediately when she tried to advocate for, we're going to need to have X number, increase our numbers of mental health providers, for example. And we need to provide treatments while people are still on active duty and not wait until they get out and they have more problems that are harder to treat, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to do more screening. We need to do more treatment programs, et cetera. And she was shut down. She said basically, quote, that she wasn't allowed to talk about the unseen wounds of war. It was absolutely blocked from any type of war planning in terms of the military medicine's response to traumatic stressors of war in the face of an invasion into a well-armed country when we knew we were going to have a lot of physical casualties and psychiatric casualties as a result.
But the people that are making the decision made that decision. Let's not focus on that because it's going to complicate everything. It's going to take more people, more resources.
More sources.
We're already up to a max right now. I mean, it's just more so money. Obvious.
Yeah. But but the argument, and I've seen this written about in different parts of the vast literature on combat stress, and that they talked about the leadership in the military or members of Congress or government being very vigilant and concerned about if you're too open about mental health and it's too accepting of mental health, that you can get a diagnosis, you get treatment, for that condition, that you're essentially opening the door for a mass evacuation syndrome. That people are going to choose that door instead of going to combat. They're going to choose the psychiatric door. And so making it too readily accessible, and they draw their lessons from the First World War, saying that when we use terms like shell shock, that it opened the floodgates, and that it wasn't the war itself, it wasn't the stresses of combat, it was psychiatry and creating an opportunity to escape, an honorable mechanism to avoid duty that was responsible. So that was one of the lessons learned in those post-World War I commissions, those investigative bodies, was that we had to eliminate the corrosive influence of psychiatry, as well as increase our military training, improve unit cohesion and morale, and engage in a robust psychiatric screening program, as we entered and prepared to enter the Second World War. So again, it all kind of masses together until you get into, as we'll talk about what happens in the Second World War in a little bit.
Well, that actually leads to one of the areas that the yellow part you emphasized. Yeah. So that's psychiatric screening, rejection, and more screening.
Yeah. Well, in the history books, we refer to what they call the interwar years, right? The interwar years from 1918, the conclusion of the First World War, to 1939, which was the beginning of the Second World War. And every Axis and Allied power struggled, as we talked about, with the problems of psychiatric casualties, often outpacing medical casualties, physical casualties, and creating substantial financial drains on the respective societies for the amount of pensions. Right? Again, $1 billion for about 70,000 U.S. soldiers for only 6 months of combat during the early 1900s. That was
the dollar was worth far more at that time.
More. But every power had the same problem, and they all kind of reached the same conclusion, is that one, we have to screen out weakness. But like the Germans and the Japanese took a different stance. They said, well, we're going to outlaw psychiatry and giving a psychiatric diagnosis and removing combatants for psychiatric reasons. We're going to outlaw that. And in some cases, make it punishable by death if you happen to be the German doctor, for example, who does give that psychiatric diagnosis or remove somebody from a combat position, etc. So you had this kind of wiffle blindness, as you refer to it, where we're just going to take out psychiatry. And then for the British, the French, the Americans, the Canadians, etc., the Allies, what they said, well, we're going to eliminate our mental health. So they developed very robust mental health resources toward in the middle and the end of the First World War, and trying to keep people close to the front lines. And this is that frontline psychiatric policy that we'll talk about in future episodes. But that's when that was adopted. We brought in psychiatrists and we told people that you'll give you 3 days of rest from the front lines, but you're going to go back to your unit, right? You're going to be returned to duty. So no more shell shock diagnosis and no more sending you back to the home front, unless it's absolutely you're a vegetable, then you go back. But so at the end of the First World War, there was mental health was part of the military medicine's response to combat stress. In the interwars, they did away with those mental health programs. They disbanded it. And in fact, the military, in the American military, going into the Second World War, we only had a handful of psychiatrists for the entire army. And they were in the headquarters level, and they were like in consultant roles. But they disbanded all the policies of frontline psychiatry and specialty hospitals for treating, combat neuroses that were developed in the First World War. And all that was part of that purging of weakness. We're going to get rid of the influence of psychiatry. We're going to beef up our military training in boot camp. We're going to beef up our leadership training. We're going to install greater unit morale and cohesion. And we're going to go into psychiatric screenings, right? And that leads us into the Second World War.
Yeah, here we go again.
Here we go again. So what will happen? So interesting, the head for the U.S. Army, they commissioned a very famous psychiatrist who was a disciple, one of the followers of Sigmund Freud, who actually established the field of social work, Harry Stack Sullivan.
Oh, yeah.
And Sullivan was appointed as the head for neuropsychiatric screenings, and got together all the different psychologists that were involved with testing and screening, and boy, they did it. They did a comprehensive combat or military psychiatric screenings that have never been replicated in any time since, or before or since. It was truly revolutionary what they put forward. And let me see if I can.
And it was Sullivan who.
Well, he was appointed as the head, but he got a lot of the leading psychiatrists and psychologists of the day together and developed a task force. And they said, well, how do we get rid of weakness? What are the predispositions that make human beings vulnerable to succumb to stress injuries like traumatic neurosis or whatever, shell shock, or whatever the label is of the day? And let me see if I can find this. I want to just kind of give people an idea of what they, when I say they doubled down, they doubled down. So this was in 1941, this was the policy at that time that for the American Army, as far as psychiatric screenings goes. These were people who would be rejected from service, okay? Those men with more subtle personality disorders missed by previous examiners. 2, men whose present personality makeup suggests that they may break under the special stresses and strains of camp life, and even beyond these. And 3, men who may be expected to develop some type of neuropsychiatric disorder at any time during the next 11 years were to be rejected. And what are some things they rejected people for? Well, if you had any kind of cognitive intellectual deficit, right? Borderline IQ. So that, that was borne out, and there's a reason for that. That was history of epilepsy. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. Current or past psychiatric history, any active substance abuse, incarceration history, enuresis, which is bedwetting, a history of enuresis, mind you, right, beyond the age of 5. Current medical conditions, frequent medical illness, in other words. Any medical hospitalization, if you were hospitalized for any medical reason, that was a rejection criteria because you were predisposed. History of any type of speech impediment, can't pronounce your R's, well, you're not coming in the military. Extended family psychiatric history, I mean, any aunts, uncles, grandparents, brothers and sisters, anyone who has a psychiatric history, you're rejected because you have predisposed genetic makeup. Any tendency to worry, you were asked, are you prone to worry? Are you nervous? If you answered yes to that question, you were rejected. Repeating a grade or getting poor grades in school. Parental divorce, if you were adopted, if you were ever suspended from school, if you had limited dating experiences, unstable work history, and goes on and on. And the policy was basically, when in doubt, reject. And again, if any chance this person could have a psychiatric breakdown in 11 years of military service, they were to be rejected. Right? That's what we mean by doubling down on the First World War's experiences, right, with psychiatric screening, literally doubling down.
And it shows in table 1, 7.1.
Yeah, what is that table? What does it reveal?
It's the prevalence of neuropsychiatric screening, rejections, and disability discharges. And right. World War II, there were 375,000 total disability discharges, in contrast to the 43,706 during World War I.
Those were for psychiatric disability discharges, yes. Right?
Yeah.
So that should be a red flag. And how many were screened out in the Second World War?
Screened out.
That were rejected.
Grand total rejected.
Yeah.
1,846,000.
Yeah. 1.8 million were rejected at the time of, they weren't even allowed to come in. They were screened out. These were volunteers initially, right? That were after the Pearl Harbor. People flocked to the recruiting stations, and 1.8 million were rejected for having any level of predisposition, right? As we just went over. Another estimated 1 million were rejected at some point prior to deploying in a combat zone. This was like during boot camp, during their infantry school, being staged in an area, going through mobilization. Another 1 million were rejected. So you're having almost 3 million servicemen rejected for psychiatric predispositions. Right.
Amazing.
So, but what does that mean? It really means that if that trauma pension debate controversy, right? If you taken those steps to eliminate every known, every plausible, hypothetical predisposition, right? And you eliminate psychiatry. So there's no longer an honorable way out, because we don't have psychiatry in the military anymore at the beginning of the Second World War. And so you basically had the most tested, hardy, resilient, strong military in history, right?
Legendary.
Yeah. Well, again, you've done anything you can to eliminate any weakness you can, and you might have some stragglers that get through, but 375,000, whatever it was.
That's not screening. It seems
those are psychiatric disability. Those are people who were screened in because they were without predispositions, but then succumbed. to it. In fact, the Second World War started a trend that it's continued today and after every war since the Second World War. And that is psychiatric casualties have eclipsed the total number of physically wounded and those killed in action. And now in today's day and age, it's far eclipsed. But the trend started in the Second World War, despite the context of purging out weakness. In 1942, Charles, the Battle of Guadalcanal, right? As former Marines, right? We're very aware of Guadalcanal. First Marine Division, 60% of evacuees were for psychiatric reasons. And again, these are people who were screened in, who had none of the predisposed factors, right? And that's without the influence of psychiatry. It got to the point by 1943, this is
1 year later.
Yeah, 1 year later, 2 years since the American entry into the Second World War. 1943, we were sending more people back home as psychiatric casualties than we were allowing to come in the military. And it caused a big uproar with President Roosevelt and the war planners in Washington, D.C., and the head of the American Army, George Marshall. He reversed the whole psychiatric screening program. Says we're not going to be able to win the war. We're not going to be able to even have enough people to fight the war at this rate. So let's really modify and only reject those who we think is absolutely people who can't serve, who have epilepsy or have some type of intellectual disability, but it's open to doors. Yeah.
But it was really kind of late by 1943.
That's pretty late.
It's like our entering World War I fairly late.
Right.
The damage had already been done, it seems to me, given the number of rejections.
It did. And it right there, it should have really kind of, it should have ended the whole trauma pension debate after that. Right. If the whole idea of the trauma pension debate is that most mental illness or traumatic stress injuries like PTSD are not valid because people were predisposed, and it's not the environmental events that people are exposed to, it's more their predispositions or the influence of psychiatry, that was pretty well nullified just based on what was happening from 1941 to 1943 when the American Army reversed its psychiatric screening policy and reconstituted its mental health forces. So they brought back psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers, and they re-implemented their frontline psychiatry programs and reconstituted neuropsychiatric specialty hospitals that were providing treatment for these folks who had some type of psychiatric injury at the hope of returning them to duty, etc.
And among other things, that's what we're going to be focusing on the next time we meet.
Yes.
And that will be, well, we're on 15 now. That will be number 16. It's amazing, isn't it, that we have done this so often.
Yeah.
Since, what was it, February, right?
Yeah, it just seems so
remarkable.
A while ago. Here we are. We're going through this pretty quick. And hopefully this information people find to be useful, maybe in understanding where we are and where we've been, and also where we need to go.
And where we need to avoid going, given the pattern that you were the first to identify. Wow.
Yeah,
really remarkable.
It really is. All right, so we'll pick it up next episode then.
Okay, great. See you then.
We'll see you then. Bye-bye.